So I'm gonna. Hi, thanks Lana and thanks Jeff, and it is really my honor to be giving this lecture today, and also my honor to be part of CHERN, which is very exciting. Um, New venues and platform to study the most, not even one of the most, but the most important topics in Europe and in the world today. So I'm going to share screen, and today my talk actually is based on one of my two books that I'm working on. One that I've already finished. It is about the finance and geopolitics of Hong Kong after 1997, and the other one is the one that I'm based on. That the talk is based on is about U.S.-China rivalry, and I have a deadline to meet. That is May in the spring, this spring, that I need to submit the manuscript to the publisher. So I've finished the first draft, and I'm working to want to revise it. So it is very good time that I present the thing to all the distinguished audience here, so I can get some feedbacks and questions, and will help me a lot in revising, continue to work on my manuscript. So let me share screen first to share my PowerPoint. Here it is, and um, this is my favorite cartoon, political cartoon, actually from New York Times, 2009. Um, it is a cartoon that accompanied an article by Leo Ferguson, economic historian. Used to be in UK, but now I think he's in US. That who talk about Chimerica. So in 2004, he published an article with economists talk about the fact that US and China is becoming one integrated economy, in which US become the the East Trimerica and China become the West Trimerica, just like the East Coast and West Coast of one integrated country. So he's advocating that the actual U.S. and China is coming together, become one. And at that time, other authors, and actually that the characterization is more popular in China. That is the conception of G2. So people are saying that forget about G7, forget about G20, and talk about G2. This is China and US together, join hand to rule the world. So in 2009, right after the global financial crisis, and Neil Ferguson wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and then in accompanying that op-ed, that they put this cartoon in there, so showing that China and US become the kind of a one integrated monster, kind of to run the world, and there's some people running around trying to resist, but it is a kind of a humor, and of course that Neil Ferguson recently has an interview and wrote a lot of stuff about the death of Chimerica and the rise of the new Cold War. So the recent talk about the new Cold War or US-China rivalry is really a drastic shift from just 10 years ago, when everybody is talking about US and China becoming one, just like one country, very integrated, not only harmonious, but even integrated. So the question is how to explain this rise of rivalry and then sudden change in relation. Of course, that the lazy explanation is that it is because of Trump, but I will show that in my presentation, and some of you might already notice that actually the change in relation started in Obama administration, uh, at least the second term of Obama administration. That the Trump just accelerated it, or and also to express it in a more colorful language in his Twitter, so that everybody start to notice. And I would expect it to continue. And many people already point out that it is going to continue in the Biden administration, though it might be in different forms. So why did it happen? And then I will draw a historical parallel. To anticipate my argument a little bit, is it's very much, it's not Cold War. People draw the parallel with the Soviet Union US competition, but I think it is more like UK Germany rivalry at the turn of the 20th century. I will explain why that later on, and then we need to explain why there was this sudden shift in relation and the tone of the relation. Of course, the most prominent talk is about the Liu Cold War, that I am not in agreement with, because the Liu Cold War assumption is that this rivalry is based on values and political system. But the problem is that the difference in values and political system between China and US has been around for a long time, predating the recent turn into rivalry. That's in the 1990s. It is already after Tiananmen crackdown in 1989. It's very clear that China is not going to liberalize, and actually the authoritarian system is strengthening, becoming very resilient. There's a huge literature about authoritarian resilience in China. And even economically, that the state-owned sector, it is very clear after right after China joining WTO that China state enterprise and state-owned sectors is not retreating; it is expanding. And it is only in the 1990s when the state sectors kind of overshadowed by the private sector. But starting in early 2000s, it is very clear, and there has been people, economists, political scientists, sociology pointing out that actually that this the triumph of market uh, economy and then private enterprise and even township village enterprise is over. That the state-owned enterprise and national champions is on the rise. So this kind of difference in political system and economic system, the state capitalism, so-called, or market capitalism, is not new. Then if it is the rivalry is about that, why it didn't happen until now? Why in the early 2000s and up to 2009, 2010, despite these big differences in ideology and system, U.S. and China can still be that collegial and amicable, that relation. So this really cannot explain that. And of course, that this political scientists' explanation about foresee these traps and quick power competition, saying that uh, if it is in the international system without clear hegemony, and there's a rising power, there's an established power, so the clash between the rising power and the established power will be inevitable. And so a lot of IR and political scientists would go for that. That is fine. That I see that as a very, in the IR language, a very realist conception of international relation, and in the sociological language, it is a very Weberian view of the state. That actually Weber wrote explicitly about this: the state foreign policy is driven by the sentiments of prestige, and the will and the drive to glory. So it is this state elite who want to dominate others in the international field, and is a kind of autonomous state acting in terms of their own interest, in terms of glories and prestige. So it's very Weberian, and there's a long tradition in sociology and political science, and there's a I don't need to go into that any further. So it is a huge tradition, but the problem is that you cannot talk about U.S.-China relation without talking about economic relation, and the particular relation among business corporations on the China side and on the U.S. side. And here we have a number of Marxian, neo-Marxian, or lots very Marxian and half Marxian or inspired by Marxian kind of literature that bring in the business corporations, not in terms of U.S.-China relation in particular, but U.S. foreign policy in particular, in general. So you have William Robinson, who explained the U.S. promoting democracy policy in terms of the lead of transnational cooperation. Of course, you have the late Leo Panitch talking about the U.S. foreign policy in terms of the imperative of promoting open economy and open trade, open investment environment in terms of U.S. TNC interests. And you have this business networks explanation of U.S. trade policy. Of course, we have also this work about looking at how the business elite network and the foreign policy elite network, how they intersect and interact to create different types of foreign policy in the U.S. So we need to really bring the business corporation back in. That is what I try to do in explaining U.S.-China changing relation. To get back to the origins of U.S.-China economic collegiality or close relation in the 1990s and 2000s, you really need to get back to the right after the end of the Cold War, because U.S.-China relation is very good since Nixon and Kissinger in the 70s, in the 80s, because of the common enemy, that is the Soviet Union. And actually that U.S.-China trade back in that time is quite minimal. It's not significant for both sides. So basically, the U.S.-China policy and China-U.S. policy is driven by the need to contain Soviet Union, in particular to contain Soviet Union expansion in Southeast Asia via Soviet proxy in the region, that is Vietnam. So after the Soviet Union collapsed after the end of Cold War, that is actually reckoning and re-examination of the relation on both sides, both in Beijing and in Washington. And the Beijing side is very interesting that right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that people forgot about it. There was quite a serious economic crisis in 92 and 93. And after Tiananmen, of course, there's the stalling of the economic engine. And then 1992, Deng Xiaoping have this Southern tour, and many people praise the Southern tour as we start the economic reform, we start the China's economic miracle. But the immediate aftermath of the Southern tour is actually chaos. Because after Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour, there was a huge surge in debt-financed investment of local government and state enterprise. So they built stuff that is not making money. And then it led to a fiscal crisis of the state. And at that time, China is not export-oriented. In the 1990s and up to early 1990s, China is very domestic-oriented, driven by agricultural growth and rural industries, the township village enterprise growth. So China's foreign exchange reserve is not doing great. And because of the post-Southern tour expansion of investment, so China import a lot of machines, materials, and so that actually China was hitting a balance of payment crisis, and the foreign exchange reserve was dissipating. And also there's a runaway inflation. And the inflation that helped precipitate the unrest in 1989 was like 20% in 1998 and 1989. And 92 and 93, that inflation was even higher, hitting nearly 25%. At that time, you look at US Congress discussion of China, Nancy Pelosi is saying that, look, that China is in great economic crisis. We are going to expect another Tiananmen very soon. So they're wrong, but it is how dire the situation is then in 92, 93. And then Zhu Rongji at that time is the vice premier. The Li Pang was the premier of China. At that time, he was already in charge of economic policy, and Li Pang is not doing anything, just sitting there. And then Zhu Rongji is already took charge because Deng Xiaoping trusts him and told everybody to listen to him on economic policy. So Zhu Rongji actually and convened a meeting in October 1993, and to call all the rural cadres to Beijing and tell them that the economy situation is very dire, but don't worry, because I just meet with Morgan Stanley boss the other day, and they say that they guarantee that they're going to support China. They're going to pour a lot of money into China via Hong Kong. So don't worry. But more importantly, so it was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You can imagine that actually they are very panicking about the economic situation because they really see that it is a possibility that they will go down. And it's like a few years after Tiananmen. So they are really worried about that the CCP rule might be shaken after the end of Cold War. And more importantly, that Zhu Rongji put forward a very radical economic transformation policy that at that time it is a secret speech. It is not open. But after he retired, that the government published all his speeches. Now it is open. We can know what he said in that conference in October 1993. He said that we are bad in the foreign exchange reserve in export, so we need to boost export. But now the township village enterprise and agriculture has used up a lot of resources and hold up a lot of surplus labor. So we need to slow down a little bit. So the policy is to shift away from agriculture and rural industry investment and to disinvest the countryside in inland actually, and then create a huge surplus labor urge to move to the coastal export-oriented industries. And then, of course, in 1994, they devaluate the renminbi, the currencies, and then there's a big push in export. So it is the plan that is to turn China into export-oriented industrialization, just like Japan and Four Tigers, to get away from this domestic oriented rural agriculture and rural industries oriented growth in the 80s. So China is trying to, and Zhu Rongji trying to turn China's economy into that very different direction as a remedy to the economic crisis. So it was the argument that I have in my previous book, The China Boom. And interestingly, when the Chinese state press, CITIC, translated into simplified Chinese character versions, there's a lot of critical views is not censored, and they keep it there. Even in some paragraph, I criticized early Xi Jinping policy of putting more emphasis on urbanization and things like that. And they keep those paragraphs there. But whenever I talk about capitalism in China or Chinese capitalism, they translate it into market socialism with Chinese characteristics. So it is okay to criticize Xi Jinping, but it's not okay to say China is capitalist. And I have a short piece just published in actually the Nana is already also there, that is in a kind of a symposium, book symposium in for Tobias books, and in the socio-economic review I talk about this this interesting story. I can have another talk on that, but besides that, I still characterize China as totally capitalist, and not totally, but mostly capitalist, and we might go to that question in Q&A. So it is the export-oriented capitalist transformation in the early 1990s that China actually lead foreign markets, particularly U.S. market most. But it was in an unfortunate time when the U.S. also we evaluate its relation with China in the early 1990s, and in 1993 also is a kind of a year when Clinton came to power. So it was more than a decade of Republican administration. Now that Clinton came in, and then the early Clinton administration, the foreign policy team is filled with human rights idealists, Winston Lord, Madeleine Albright, and also Christopher Warren. They really are serious about pushing human rights and democratization as a kind of foreign policy goal. And it was right after the Cold War, and everywhere it seems to be democratizing. So it's very optimistic. So they really want to set the U.S.-China policy on that tone as well. That is to tie the China relation with human rights. So in the first year of Clinton, that Clinton rolled out a very important policy that is at that time that is the most favored nation status of China, that is to allow China export to have low tariff access to U.S. market. And then the Clinton policy in 1993 is that to list out 7 human rights conditions, and saying that if China didn't make improvement on any 2 of the human rights conditions, that China's goods low tariff access to the U.S. market will be revoked. So there's an annual renewal process. So the Clinton policy is that to tie China trade with human rights, and it is very popular among the labor movement because they don't want free trade, and they don't want free trade with country with low independent union and low wage and things like that. So it is a Clinton policy. So it is a bad time because right at the time when China policy is to pursue to opening up more U.S. market for China export, because China want to move toward, and that time the U.S. is still now the biggest market for China manufactured products. So it is a bad time when U.S. threatened to close the door on human rights ground, and actually it is interesting that we can have time to talk about it in Q&A. That is recently that you can see that the Biden administration is rolling out so-called the labor-centered trade policy, and to start to tie the human right with the trade and tariff again, that with the Congress in the US is talking about this kind of a banning imports of slave labor-based goods from Xinjiang and things like that. So we are back to this kind of 1993 Clinton regime of tying human right with trade. So it's a bad time that I don't have time to go over the detail, but I have an article just out in the Review of International Political Economy to talk about this history of this Clinton policy. But it didn't last long because China at that time mobilized U.S. corporations and target some influential U.S. corporations, Boeing and AT&T and some oil company, to offer them the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding and Contract, and drilling rights to the South China Sea and the Inner Mongolia oil field for U.S. oil company, to mobilize them into kind of a proxy lobbies to lobby Democrats in the Congress and the Clinton administration to take out the human rights condition on China trade. And they succeed in 1994. So under the pressure of this corporate lobbying mobilized by Beijing, they managed to force Clinton to reverse the policy to take out all human rights conditions. And so it was the automatic get into this automatic renewal of most favored trade relations status of China from 94 onward, and then all the way to the permanent MFN status, and then China accession to the WTO in 2001, and the rest is history. And actually, it's very interesting to look back in the 1990s that the foreign policy elite in the US is really starting to see China as a rival, not only on human rights ground, but also on South China Sea. US China or China with US allies in the region conflicts over South China Sea with Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and actually start to spike in the 1990s. And in 1996, there was a Taiwan Strait crisis when China shoot missile into Taiwan, across Taiwan Strait, and then Clinton sent a kind of a aircraft carrier group into the Taiwan Strait, and also, of course, the Belgrade Chinese embassy bombing by the U.S. military during the war over Kosovo in 1999, and also 2001. That is the South China spy plane incidents. So you see this in the intelligence, military, and foreign policy circle in the U.S. They already start to see China as a rival. So there is already this new Cold War rhetoric that China is the new competitor that U.S. need to take seriously. But this kind of the rival view or antagonistic view and hostile view in the foreign policy establishment never took hold. Why then the corporation mobilization to lobby for pro-China policy is the explanation that initially they are not interested in China trade. They are more focusing on NAFTA in Mexico in the early 1990s, but it is China's government that surgically target influential corporation and mobilize them to lobby for this China policy. So in the 1990s, the new Cold War, even though the foreign policy establishment kind of moving toward that, but it was restrained by the business lobbying. And then with this kind of a China successful turn to export-oriented industrialization, that was the beginning of the China boom. And also you see it ending with the economic slowdown and the changing of the economic structures in the recent 10 years. And people look at GDP and actually showing about the same curve, but I would prefer looking at the manufacturing PMI, purchasing manufacturer index, as a kind of a more reliable indication of Chinese expansion and stagnation or contraction. So because this data has two sources, one official source and one private source done by Caixin, the private magazines in China, and previously it was done by HSBC years ago. So you have an official source and you have a private source. You can cross track, and so it's more reliable. So this the black lines are the PMI, manufacturing PMI. The 50 is the line of stagnation. There's low expansion, no contraction. Above 50 is expansion. Below 50 is contraction. I updated all the way to December 2020. So you see that before the global financial crisis, it has been solidly expanding, the Chinese manufacturing expanding, and it is the global financial crisis 2008. And then the stimulus that the Chinese State Bank opened the floodgate of the lending, and it shoot up and it rebound very strongly. And then you must be very familiar with the story that the stimulus led to overcapacity, falling profits, and indebtedness of enterprise and local government, so that it become a drag on the economy. So the economy start to slow down, fizzle out, taper off. And you can see that after 2010, 2011, that the economy is hovering around the stagnation line, up and down. And every time when the economy dipped too far, that the government will open the floodgate of state banks lending again to push it up a little bit, prevent it from falling too badly. So you can see this pattern that is like an addiction, drug addiction, that they lead more and more long each time to push up the economy a little bit. And the biggest push is, of course, is last year because of the COVID. So there's a big drop in manufacturing. And then the government in the January actually and February, they opened the floodgate of state loan again. And so it's a big spike. And then you see this kind of recent recovery and spike in manufacturing activities, also driven by export growth because the whole world is under lockdown and China is one of the few countries that's still exporting. The other example actually is Vietnam. Then the recent economic data show that Vietnam is even growing faster and Taiwan than mainland China, but definitely is rebounds and frank to the export market, and actually for the big surge in loans. So it is this kind of the faltering of the China bond is much like Japan after 1990s, that it is this unprofitable overcapacity companies that is survived by getting loans, keep borrowing, and then they keep accumulating debt that they surviving, but they are not very dynamic and profitable. So it is this ending of the China boom lead to the challenge of Xi Jinping when he came to power in 2012, 2013. He faced this challenge of how to jumpstart the economy and then find a new dynamics and new source of growth of the economy to fight against the slowdown. So there are two solutions. The one solution is technological upgrading, definitely, and then we see a lot of discussion and literature about China moving to high tech exports, and as just like when the four tigers in Japan, labor intensive manufacturing and investment driven growth taper off, they move to high tech and then get another 10 or 20 years of high speed growth. So China is trying to follow this path and has a lot of achievement, but at the same time that we need to be careful about the data, because there's a lot of people counting the number of patent um, coming from China and registered in China to look at technological advance. But the sheer number of the patent is not a good indicator, because like Bloomberg, in looking at, because when you register your invention in the patent, you need to renew it to pay a fees every year to keep the patent. They find that actually more than 90% of the China originated patents are not renewed after 5 years, meaning that they are not commercially viable. And cannot be translated into kind of a real production related, profit related activities. And other indicators interesting, because we have this data about this for a country, how much it is paying other countries for copyright and patent, and also how much other countries are paying that country for copyright and patent. You subtract the two number, you get a intellectual property balance of payment. Of course, that is a lot of them are patent, but there's a lot of them are like image right, copyright. Like if you make a Mickey Mouse in China, you need to pay Disney the copyright of the image of the Mickey Mouse and things like that. But more of that are actually patent, that if you make a cell phone using US registered technology, that you need to pay the patent holder of that technology. So you look at this balance of payment of intellectual property right, you see that US is a big surface country. That is a lot of productive and profitable patents are registered in the US. So countries are paying the US to build those stuff. Japan and Germany definitely is also a surplus country, and South Korea is likely, even though our conception of South Korea is already very high tech, but it's still a slightly on the deficit, because, for example, Samsung is making all these TV and high tech product and cell phone, but a lot of the technology is actually the registers somewhere, so they need to pay the countries that hold the patent, actually, for example, US, to make that product in South Korea. And China, actually, that's the balance of payment or in intellectual property right is increasing and expanding. And one reason is that even though China is the product mix in the export is moving up the technological ladder, is exporting more and more sophisticated product, but they are using technology that is patented and registered somewhere else in Japan and Europe and the US. So they need to pay those countries. So in that sense, then China is not exactly the technologically sufficient, self-sufficient countries. And there's a recent report about the China-made airplane, the C919, that the report is that actually all the components that make enable it to fly are actually components imported from Europe or US. So they just put the thing together, and even if they manufacture the component, they need to pay the patent to the patent holding countries. So in technological front, that China is a long way to go, and I can give another talk about this, all this, and actually that Rick Applebaum has a recent books about talking about this the limits of the China innovation system. So it is also the source of the business corporation complaining, U.S. business corporation complaining about China. So all latecoming industrializing countries have this stage of relying on foreign patents in manufacturing. And then so the thing is that they pay the patent and then manufacture the high-tech product. The source of complaint or the conflict between U.S. corporation and China corporation, and actually then there's some complaint from European corporation like Siemens, for the high-speed rail, that they are complaining that they are using the technology without paying. Basically, that's so it is this whole debate about intellectual property theft or the technology transfer come from here. And the interesting thing is that Japan and Four Tigers underwent this phase when they try to make things without allegedly without paying the patents, and then they're sued by U.S. and put pressure by U.S. To show up its intellectual property protection, and they yield because they are geopolitically subservient to the U.S. So they have to compromise and listen to the U.S. pressure. And in the end, but it worked well for them, because after they show off the intellectual property protection regimes, and they show up their own innovation system, and they it facilitate their rise as a kind of autonomous innovation and technology center, so that they can start to develop their own technology. And the story of Japan is very interesting and very telling. And China is geopolitically independent, so far it can withstand U.S. pressure on this intellectual property right issue. Then it is also one reason why China is struggling to build up its indigenous innovation system itself. But we can go on forever, but we can get back to it in Q&A if you are interested. So another remedy for this slowdown is the Belt and Road. Actually, that's these are the graph of the revenue growth of three biggest construction machine maker in China. It's XCMG, Sany, and Zoomlion. They are making earth-digging machines. They are making construction machine, crane, and all that stuff. And then you see that in 2009, 2010, they have a good time because of the stimulus. A lot of construction, high-speed road, real estate constructions, and airport, steel mill, and coal plant, and things like that. So they have a lot of order. But after the stimulus taper off, that the revenue growth actually went badly and to a negative territory. So they were in trouble. And then it went back up again. And then if you look at the company reports of this company, after 2014 and 2015, they explicitly in their company report thank Xi Jinping for Belt and Road, because now that their order didn't come from domestic, because China has run out of thing to build that is profitable. The high-speed rail is basically over. They have built more coal plant than they needed, and then most of the order now come from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka, come from Kazakhstan, from all these Belt and Road country. So it is how Belt and Road work. That is the Chinese state bank lend money to these foreign countries, and then these foreign countries order materials and actually hire contractors from China to build the stuff for them. And there's a recent CSIS report finding that all these projects in developing world financed by China alone, 90% of the project use Chinese contractor, in comparison to, for example, project financed by Asia Development Bank and World Bank, that only 40% contracted to contractors from Europe, and then about 40 and 50% are local contractors in the developing countries. So this China loan is unconditional. They don't mess with your policy and political system, that they just lend money. But there's another kind of condition, that is many of the borrower who borrow this loan have to hire Chinese company and buy Chinese materials. Is how it keep this Chinese company afloat. And then it is a source of conflict between the US and China. And so I am quoting another scholars from saying that why US corporations in the 1990s and 200s, they used to be proxy lobbies for Beijing, but now some of them have become anti-China insurgents, and some of them at least are less enthusiastic in lobbying for China. So I have a lot of cases I don't have time to look into, but if you are interested, we can talk about it definitely more and details in the Q&A. So, and this kind of policy actually lead to this showering of relation, and it started to surface in Obama. That when Hu Jintao visited the U.S. in 2011, Obama in the joint press conference say right in front of Hu Jintao to the press that now we have a problem. U.S. Companies are not treated fairly, and there's all this issue of intellectual property and unfair regulations and market access issues. And you can look at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in China. They have a business climate survey. Um, uh, um, that I'm looking at the chat box to see whether I have some message for me to tell me to hurry up. I will hurry up, but actually that is. But anyway, that let us.
You have at least 10 minutes left.
Okay. Yep. So they have this survey and showing that many U.S. corporations in China feeling increasingly unwelcome and increasingly so that that is vast majority. There's some slight improvement in the last 2 years, but mostly that they still feel less welcome. And then I have amassed a kind of a huge database on different measure on this U.S. corporation in China. First is this U.S. to China FDI flow. Actually, it's slowed down and it stayed flat, but it stopped to grow after 2010 or so. That not like right after China getting into WTO, that is a huge surge, but then it's dropped down and then stopped growing. And more importantly, in the U.S. Congress, there's a kind of a lobbying database because in 1996 there's a Lobbying Disclosure Act that dictating that all lobbying activities need to be documented. On what issues, how many you spend on that lobbying, and what companies, and what are your clients, and things like that. So I mastered the kind of a lobbying database and pull out all China-related lobbying from the early 2000s to recently. You see that the issues is mostly about market access. That's the companies are lobbying U.S. Congress to do something about the limitation of market access for U.S. companies. So it spiked and peak around 2009, 2010. It dropped a little bit, but it's stay at high level. It stopped growing, but it stay at the level. And also intellectual property rights is also another key issue when it comes to China-related lobbying, that the U.S. companies are lobbying Congress to do something to protect the intellectual property rights. So this technological transfer is a big issue. Again, it peaked around 2009, 2010. And you look at U.S. corporate lawsuit against Chinese entities in U.S. courts. Also, you see that they start to grow exponentially after 2009, 2010. And you look at the content, mostly about intellectual property rights and technology. So you see this kind of a heightening of this lawsuit of U.S. corporation against Chinese counterparts. And I look at the Fortune 500, U.S. Fortune 500s, top 10 and also top 30 as well. But I only show you the top 10 companies exposure to China here to look at the company report and look at how many times they mention China in their company report. So you see this huge surge until recently. There's a huge drop, meaning that these top, at least the biggest companies, exposure to China is declining. And of course, there are two reasons. Why? One is that there's some company that has nothing to do with China or little to do with China. Search account become kind of a top company like Google. They don't have business in China. They cannot operate in China, but they become a top company that they definitely won't talk about China a lot, and Facebook and all these companies, but also company that used to have more exposure to China, like those automobile company and pharmaceutical company that their China operation is scaling back. And the one of the most widely reported case, of course, is Apple, that is still a lot of stake in China, but it is starting to diversify in terms of its productions and market. So you see this kind of a so-called decoupling. It's not very extreme, but starting to happen between U.S. corporation and China. And then the interesting thing is that some corporations actually shift the position in lobbying from lobbying for China-friendly policy to lobbying for China not-so-friendly policy. One example is Caterpillar, that I can talk about it more that in Q&A if you're interested, but that is corporate lobbying activity regarding China's shift. So what happened is that the geopolitically, that the U.S. foreign policy elite has been quite seeing China as a rival in an antagonistic way ever since the 1990s. But in the 1990s and 2000, it is the U.S. corporations lobbying that put a restraint on the urge to for the U.S. political establishment to really go all out to treat China as a rival and adopt more confrontational policy. The particular manifestation is that in the 1990s and 2000s, whenever you have a bill in Congress that, for example, accused China of currency manipulation, uh, uh, supporting Tibet or Taiwan or Hong Kong, that when in Congress, when the bill start to flow in Congress, it's never get anywhere because the corporate lobbying will be lobbying against those bill, and then the Congress representative will know that, so it's not put in the top priority in the agenda. Some of them never voted. Some of them when voted is voted down. So it was a situation in the 1990s and 2000s. But in recent years, you see an interesting thing that in the US Congress, it is very bipartisan. Republican and Democrat voting everything on party line. But when it comes to China or China-related bill on Tibet and Xinjiang or Taiwan and Hong Kong and everything that will make Beijing unhappy, you get bipartisan support, and many of these bills are passed unanimously. If not unanimously, only like 2 votes against, and everybody else agree. So it is an indication that the business lobbying is no longer there to lobby against those bills. So this kind of a constraint on the U.S. political elites treating China as a rival, as a geopolitical rival, is no longer there. So it is. Another thing is, of course, this China's competition with U.S. corporation go beyond the Chinese market. And I'm going to skip all this slide because of time constraint. But because of the Belt and Road, the Belt and Road is not driven by China FDI. It's driven by China alone. And the most of the China's expansion of influence is through lending money to Belt and Road country, and then those countries start to hire Chinese contractors and buy Chinese materials, and it created the competition for Chinese U.S. corporation. One example is Caterpillar, the construction machine maker in the U.S. They explicitly lobby for the Obama administration to do free trade agreement with developing countries because they explicitly say that we are becoming less and less competitive with our Chinese competitors. They used to be our partner in China, but they start to make machines that actually look exactly the same as ours, but like half the price. Now they're competing with us in the Caribbean market, in Latin American market, in Asian market. So US need to do something to make us more competitive. So this kind of a US corporation being squeezed by China is not restricted to China market, but also in foreign market as well. So this Belt and Road also helped to escalate the US corporations increasing negative or at least less positive view on China and the China's interest. So it is why that in 2010, around 2010, 2011, that this relation between US-China suddenly turned sour. And because basically that after the stimulus taper off in China, that the Chinese corporation is running into overcapacity and profitability problem. So they lead to revive their profitability by being aggressive both in Chinese market and overseas market. And the consequence is squeezing out many U.S. corporations, and U.S. corporations are under pressure, and then so their relation with China turns sour, and they become less enthusiastic in lobbying for China. Some of them even lobbying against China nowadays. And when this kind of a corporate restraint on the geopolitical urge to treat China as rival is lifted, a lot like in the 1990s and 2000s. And then the foreign establishment with elite in US go all out to treat China as a rival and adopt all this policy to get into this US-China rivalry. And then the same on the China side. And so it is the end of the main presentation. But for I want to end. I don't have time to talk too much history about this UK-Germany rivalry, but we can get back to it in the Q&A when we have time. In the very end, I want to conclude by looking at the prospect of this US, Europe, and China triangular relation, which is very interesting. Under Trump, of course, that US seems to be decoupling from China or from the world. But you look at trade data, the US is still having a lot of trade with China and the rest of the world. But the conception is that then China can alternatively seek more closer economic relation with Europe to supersede US. But the sad structure of the world economy is that in the last 20, 30 years, globalization is led by the US and is driven by the US through the WTO and many organizations. And one key attraction of the US in attracting other people to get into the game of the globalization is that US is a big consumers, the consumer of last resort. You look at the top 10 surplus country and top 10 trade deficit countries, US is way up in the kind of a top deficit country, meaning that it is consuming much more than it produces. So it can do it because the US dollar's hegemonic position in the world economy, that US can run a trade deficit without any problem with currency crisis or financial crisis, because that US can literally print US dollar to pay the world to buy all this stuff. So the whole world is actually very much relying on US as the consumers. It is how globalization works. When US asks countries to join the game of globalization, US attraction is to, like, if you join the globalization, you can export your goods to my market. So it is how US try to get the TPP or the TIPP with Europe and things like that. And all other major economy, including China and Germany, and most of the major European economies, they are net surplus country, meaning that they are exporting more than they consume. So the structures is that you need to have a kind of a complementarity in these trade things, where somebody produce and somebody consume. That if US is left out of the equation, and we talk about China-Europe trade union, but we are talking about a trade deal between two net exporter. So it is not going to do very well, because in the end, everybody have overcapacity without enough consumer. So this kind of a globalization and global free trade without the US will be very difficult to pull off unless people shrink their trade surplus and then consume more. But right now we are still hopelessly relying on the big spenders in the US and the consumerism in the US for the globalization. So it is a challenge. How it play out, it will remain to be seen. And of course, one explanation is that China is trying to get the investment deal with Europe and then trade deal with Europe, that the primary purpose is to make US jealous, and then to as a kind of bargaining chip for the US to revise its policy on China. But we will see how it goes. But it doesn't look good on the outset, because of the structures of the global political economy, that when you have a let export trading with one another, that you try to export to one another, and then rather than consume other people's goods, and it will create trade conflict in the long term. So let me end here, and then I look forward to your comments and also Jeff comments as a discussion, and all your questions. That thanks for your attention. That probably I can stop share screen now and see.
Thank you very much, Ho-fung, for this fascinating expose of shifts in US-China relations, also historically embedded. There are already many interesting questions in the chat and also in the Q&A, but we are going to save them. I think it will be a very lively discussion. Because first, we actually would like to give the floor to Professor Jeffrey Henderson, who has prepared also some discussion points, and also explicitly will relate them to China and Europe and the work of CHERN. So you can just sit back now, Professor Hung, and listen in here for the next 10 or so minutes. And I'd love to give the floor to Jeff.
No, thanks for the introduction, and Ho-fung, many thanks indeed for a great talk. You covered an awful lot of ground there. And I'm sure had this been the old days when lectures went on far, far longer than 45 minutes, you would have covered a lot more ground as well, right? I actually rather like the old days. Maybe they'll come back, but I doubt it, right? There's three, possibly four things that I want to pick up on, as Nana suggested, how some of your analysis may connect with Europe in various ways. And I'll come to that in a minute, but I want to start with the contention which goes throughout your talk. You started with yourself, but also goes throughout your talk, right? That really US China foreign policy is driven by, if you like, the cycles of intercapitalist rivalry between China and the United States. And it's those cycles, those ups and downs that help explain US policy towards China, rather than questions of ideology, broadly speaking. I obviously agree with that general analysis, but I personally would be a little more cautious about kicking out the issues of ideology too quickly. The reason it seems to me why it's helpful to hang on to these issues is because of the nature of a large part of the common consciousness, and as far as that understands China in the United States. And a large part of that, it seems to me, is as it always has been from the 19th century, deeply ideological, and of course inflected significantly with racism. And it's important to hang on to that, because that gives us important clues as to how US-China rivalry might develop, might play in the media in the United States, for instance, and might play in terms of pressure on legislators in the United States. So yes, intercapitalist rivalry driving US foreign policy, agreed, largely, but these important ideological dimensions, it seems to me, we need to hang on to there. And these are not just nuances. I think they are fundamental to the core of the whole explanation, partly in the past, but certainly what that may well become in the future. My second point, and I want to turn to what this might mean for Europe here, is one of the interesting things about the major European economies, and the reason for this was nicely summed up in your last slide, I think, where you showed many of the principal European economies, crucially, with the exception of Britain, of course, right, as surplus, as exporting economies, right? And the British case is, of course, quite an interesting case, but in the European context in relation to China, it's not necessarily been an anomaly, actually, right? So as you and others plugging into this will well know, the relationship with the European Union and the principal industrial members of the European Union has pretty much been the same to China as the United States between the post-Tiananmen period from the early 1990s through to the Obama's pivot to Asia and the stuff associated with that, which you went through. So Europe was initially very open to China, and was for fairly obvious reasons. German car makers wanted to get the BMWs and Mercedes in there, and et cetera, et cetera. But interestingly, with the Obama, the tightening of the US-China relation under Obama and then subsequently under Trump, the principal European powers and the European Union has continued with this relatively relaxed relationship to China, right? Which most recently have indicated important contrasts with its response to Russia. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Whilst the US was tightening and becoming more concerned and slightly more robust, if I can use that term, in its relationship with China under Obama, you have this seemingly interesting paradox which arises in the British case at that point, where you have, this is 2013, 2015 initially that I'm talking about, where you have one of the most right-wing British governments in recent history, in a country which, since the Second World War, I beg your pardon, has arguably vied with Japan to be the United States' #1 vassal state, right? Taking a rather different line over China to the line that was then being pushed by the Obama administration. The key example of this, in the context of Britain, of course, is the signing of an agreement in 2015 to allow participation by one of China's state-owned nuclear energy companies, China General Nuclear, to be part of a consortium to build new nuclear capacity in Britain. And they do this against pressure, not merely from the British Secret Services, indeed the British military, but also heavy pressure, seemingly, from the Pentagon and the US State Department, right? Yeah. And the reason in the British case why this is true, I think, is fairly clear, because what they'd also done around that time, and this comes back to your early argument about the central key of not only the role of American capital vis-a-vis the kissing up to, or getting nice again, if I can put it that way, with China from the early 1990s. But specifically your comments about the role of finance capital in that, right? Because clearly the British decision to run with the Chinese state-owned company and bring it into the heart of such a strategic industry as nuclear power generation, with all that means for not merely power generation itself, with the wider sort of military type security issues associated with that, it seems to me a product of the fact that it was a quid pro quo for an earlier agreement with the Chinese government to allow financial companies from the City of London greater access to China financial services, and the supposed bonanza that was likely to be. Yes. So, that's a peculiar British case, but it's rather similar, it seems to me, to the way in which European foreign policy, or at least the foreign policy of Europe's principal industrial powers, has played out consistently since the early 1990s, certainly, and much more recently, since the beginning of the 2000s, right? Where you continue to have this, reluctance to engage directly with the Chinese government, and to certainly verbally, occasionally criticize it. Most recently, of course, over Xinjiang and Hong Kong. But when it comes down to it, not to back those words with any serious action. And most recently, as I said earlier on, you have that interesting contrast with Russia, with this guy being Novichok poisoned and, and et cetera, and other stuff that's been going on with Russia. And what you get there, of course, with these recent statements from, I think, the German foreign ministry, or one of the senior ministers in the current German government, threatening to block the new gas pipeline that's coming from Russia into Germany. So, and the reason for that, the reason for the contrast of, the light touch with the Chinese government, but the seemingly more heavy touch with the Russian government is fairly obvious. There isn't that much money to be made in Russia by German and other major European business corporations. But there is, or at least there potentially, they hope, seems to be, with regard to China, right? Again, justifying your fundamental thesis, but with interesting sort of nuances, right? What that issue is leading towards, I think, and pointing towards, I suspect, is the early beginnings of certainly the European Commission itself in terms of member states in the European Union, maybe not at the present moment in time, but within the Commission, it seems to me there's beginning to be evidence of a wish to position the European Union as a third force, if you like, between the United States and China, for a whole variety of reasons, some of which I've just alluded to, right? Now, if that were to happen, I think there are very good arguments that that would, in terms of international relations in general, but particularly US-China rivalry, be a major positive intervention, right? The chances of it happening, however, are unfortunately quite slim, because it seems to me to be very difficult to pull that off unless the European Union had much more centralized authority than it has at this moment in time. And with that, of course, its own foreign policy, right? Not to mention its capacity to draw on some sort of military power, as distinct from that of its member states, right? The fourth thing that I want to pick up on is something that you hoped to get to but didn't quite get to, and that is the parallels between the current US-China rivalry and German-British rivalry, driven again by capitalist rivalries and imperial rivalries in that context towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And what I mention here is the real dangerous elephant. I don't know if that's the right term to use here, but anyway, let me use it, which is at the back of all this, which I'm sure you and some of your work you've alluded to, if not engaged with anyway, in terms of China-US rivalry, right? And that is the extent to which this rivalry, for the structural reasons that you brilliantly pointed to, right, is driving tendencies towards a Sino-US war, right? Now, I'm sure other people who are plugging into this possibly know very well Paul Kennedy's brilliant book, which was published in the late 1980s, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. For those of you who don't know that book, that is a survey of 500 years of European history and a magisterial survey. And the argument is that when you get the beginnings of economic decline in a hegemon, right, that automatically encourages, as one of the things that encourages the rise of potentially new hegemons that come to challenge that currently or until recently dominant hegemon, right? And as some people in this listening into this will know, Kennedy's conclusion to that argument, right, and the way he puts this is it's almost as an iron law of history, is that those situations always lead to war. And that's, in a way, the really, really depressing thing that's potentially behind US-China rivalry and what's driving it. But let me finish there on that depressing note.
Let me respond by starting with the depressing notes, then to add a dose of optimism in there. Thanks for mentioning Paul Kennedy, because the slide that I don't have time to cover that I mean to end the whole presentation is actually about Paul Kennedy. Let me share it again. That's where I can see whether I can. Here, Paul Kennedy. Actually, before the rise and fall of great power, he has this rise of Anglo-German antagonism. That is the parallel. That and actually, you read his book and then read Lenin's about this imperialism and higher stage of capitalism. In some paragraph, you might think that they are talking about the Belt and Road, because like Germany at that time is exporting capital by lending money to overseas to buy German steel and to buy German machines to build railroad. And the key, one of the key focal point of competition is emerged when the Germans start to build the Berlin-Baghdad railroad that cut through Serbia, cut to Istanbul, and then all the way to Baghdad. So German bank is aggressively expanding to lend money to Austria-Hungary and to Ottoman to build the section of the railroad and to use German materials. And then it is first intercapitalist competition. First, Russia and British want to join the game and compete with German banks to lend the money, but the German banks dominated. So it created competition, and also the competition between steel makers and train car makers. And it has a geopolitical dimension because the railroad cut through the sphere of influence of British Empire and the Russian Empire. And then it escalated the rivalry at the turn of the 20th century. In the end, it turned to war. And then Paul Kennedy is saying that the fundamental is economic, but it takes some contingent decision on either side to turn it into war. Of course, that you cannot have a kind of a hypothetical history, but just fast forward to today, that U.S.-China rivalry definitely has a tendency toward war, but I also see a possibility of the rivalry continue without going into war. The key difference between today and the early 20th century is that now we have a host of multilateral global governing institutions that constitutes an alternative arena for rivalry. So if the Trump approach might more likely to lead to war, that this kind of a realist, I take on a bully with another bullying move, and then it can really take the war. But the other half of the foreign policy elite, particularly in Biden administration and Democratic side, they are trying to divert the competition to competition of influence over these kind of global institutions that Nana know a lot, that her special issue in the Review of International Political Economy talk about this multilateral order that is exciting about this, that let's take the competition to WHO, the WTO, and then the UN, and then it can contain, it's still rivalry, but it can take in the form of a less deadly way, that if it works out to influence these global governing institutions. But of course, it's not a guarantee that it can really prevent war. They think that the League of Nations was enough to prevent war after the First World War, but it didn't. But we still have hope there. Of course, that maybe China can also learn from Europe, in the sense that the Europeans turned their nationalist rivalry into football rivalry. So it's another way to divert the energy of nationalism to a less deadly kind of competition. But it is not that said, but I agree that the dangers is there, that we always need to be aware of it. We can't be naive to think that the rivalry will go away, but the best we can do is to divert the rivalry to a less deadly direction. And in response to your other comment, that yes, that is the Europe-China, US relation is about capital, and the EU-China deal, that I am cautiously pessimistic about it, that it can pull off, but it might not. It likely it not going anywhere, not because of the human rights consideration. I always have a cynical view about this human rights talk. It is many times it is the pretext of something else. The more important thing is this kind of intercapital, in the competition between different capital factions. That offices, even in Germany, you have the capital faction that benefit a lot and push for this US-China deal with like Benz and BMW and all these automobile company. But at the same time, behind the background, actually, there's some report about it, but they are not that vocal. We don't notice it, but it is there. For example, some company like Siemens, they have a competition with Chinese export of high-speed rail train car. Of course, the China train car use a lot of Siemens technology and pay license for that, but at the same time that you see the relation, the Siemens has a great time in the high-speed rail expansion in China back in 2010 and 2011, but later on that also the Japanese high-speed rail company, that they find that the Chinese train car is very competitive and using technology that look very like theirs, and even the appearance of the train car look like theirs, but they are much cheaper. So they are competing with the Chinese export of this train car in other markets, Belt and Road, for example, for this high-speed rail. So there's a fraction of the, another example is in Mittelstand, that there's a lot of Chinese company try to invest in this small company in Germany, but the whole point is to get a hold of the patent. Rather than really running the company, just like trying to buying a Volvo, that they are interested in the patent. So there's a long-term interest of this sector is to try to protect the patents and the technology from a long-term rivalry from Chinese capital. So there's different capital. That some are more eager to get to China market and benefit from a closer relation with China, but there's some capital also are more hesitant and even hostile. And as you said, and as I mentioned in the graph, that structurally that Germany is a net exporter, as in many other European economy, and China is, and now China and Germany has a kind of a not exactly high-speed road, but a railroad linkage from CHERN all the way to Germany and Poland. And the report about it is that the train car from China to Europe is full of stuff. And then they don't have enough stuff to pack the car to go back to China. So it is the imbalance of the situation that a lot of German companies might not be that enthusiastic. So there's a difference. So, and it then come down to the balance of power among different factions of capital. And finance is one of them. And telecommunication is another example that, and the last look about ideology. Yes, actually, it's still important in a kind of a different way that you mentioned racism, and it's always there. That sometimes you can compare this Europe or US view towards China against Russia. That some of the difference can be explained in terms of race, but I don't go too far on that because besides racism in US and in the Western civilization, I would use the term more general term that's Orientalism. Racist bias is one of it, but there's another part that is this kind of romanticizations and idealization. It dates back to the Jesuits and Voltaire. That actually I'm very interested, and I cited in the first page of the China Boom that in 2008, Donald Trump, not yet a politician, but a real estate developer, actually praised China, saying that US is broke. We all need to learn from China. China is our mentor in doing business. And the same thing that Lord Sugar, who is the Donald Trump of UK running the Apprentice show, who is a very conservative businessman, at some point he said that if Jeremy Corbyn become UK Prime Minister, I'm moving to China for good because business and everything else is much better there. So this is also, besides racist discrimination, there's also this idealization of China as the Shangri-La and the paradise and everything is much better there than in declining West. And I have an early article published years ago to look at this pendulum movement between this naive idealization and racist contempt, and it has something to do with economic balance of power and political economy. So this ideology factor is important, but at the same time, this ideology factor is also driven by this intercapitalist relation to a certain extent. So it is my short. I can go on for longer. That is such inspiring comments, but I better stop here for the sake of other comments from the audience. But thanks, Jeff. That is very useful.
Okay, many thanks for your response to that, Ho-fung. It's now over to everybody else. And I've been asked to say that we won't be able to deal with all of the questions you've sent through on chat, but those that we can't deal with online will be put forwarded to Ho-fung, and
yes.
hopefully he will get back to you about those. Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Anyway, so it's over to everybody else now.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. Thanks, Jeff. And indeed, at least you can use them as input for your book because we have many really interesting questions here and we will not be able to cover them all. I will select a few as using my